Hey guys, I'm Ted. Welcome back to our lecture series, and for today's lecture we're going to take a step back from the events that they were unfolding in 1861, and we're going to do an examination. We're going to take two lectures to do an examination of the United States on one hand and the Confederate States on the other hand, to look at how they measured up going into what was now becoming the heat of conflict. But before we begin our examination of those two nations on the verge of their war, let's look at let's do our customary recap and look at what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the firing of Fort Sumter and how Fort Sumter was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the end all of the tension that had been building up since November of 1860, since Lincoln's election. With a quick very quick, rapid movement with the lower South, the deep South slave states, notably South Carolina, led the charge in filing and calling for a secession or calling for a secession convention and then passing a secession ordinance. South Carolina did that within 30 days of Lincoln's election. Followed by the six other deep South slave states: Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas and Louisiana. Following that, everyone simply tried to maneuver. There were a couple of propositions thrown out. It became very clear that the incoming Republicans who would control the national government following their victories at the polls in November of 1860, that they would be unwilling to compromise at any level on any issue regarding slavery. They expected the slavocrats, the elites in these slave states, to simply suck it up and play by the rules of the game. They decided that they had lost a lot of elections, a series of elections in the previous 30 years, and that they now wanted their day. They wanted their day in the national government, and they wanted their opponent to play fair, as they had done. The slave states responded by simply succeeded and not paying any heed to any of these overtures from the federal government. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, gave reassurances to them. Those went unheeded, and then he also drew a line in the sand, saying that he would hold, occupy, possess, and maintain all United States property. Things came to a head at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was located in Charleston. Charleston was the hotbed of just raw emotional passions for Confederates, for members in the Confederate States. It was in the hotbed, the most electrified state in the Union, with a hotbed of paranoia and intense feelings. South Carolina was, and so on April 12th, less than 6 months. About 6 months after Lincoln had been elected president, after Lincoln had won at the polls in November of 1860, they opened fire on Fort Sumter, compelling them to surrender within a day. And Lincoln, in response, called for 75,000 men to put down this rebellion. Now, Lincoln, in doing so, nudged Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas out of the United States and into the arms of the Confederate States. This made things a bit more difficult for the United States, and Lincoln thereafter attempted to tread carefully in his statements and his dealings, because he did not want to alienate the elites in the other four slave states that remained in the United States. With that being said, both nations are making war preparations. Both nations are expecting things to be done, expecting this episode to be done with fairly quickly, with maybe 1 or 2 battles. And so it is at this point now that we begin our evaluation of the United States on one hand and the Confederate States on the other. Now, in the United States, in the United States at the time, the United States had stood in April of 1861. They had an overwhelming majority, and it seems that they held an overwhelming majority in all of the crucial areas at the outset of the United States Civil War. leading to a swift and complete victory. Now, later writers wrote after the war that the Confederate States never really stood a chance in the war. And now, while chiming in that it was very admirable in the way that these Confederate States, that the Confederate States of America fought for so long against such odds, such insurmountable odds, that they would phrase it. Now, this really is not the case. The Confederate States stood a very good chance of winning the United States Civil War, and they came close to doing so on a number of occasions. And in this lecture, we will look at all the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides. And now, to begin with, we will look at the most glaring strength and weakness, and that is population. The United States had a huge population in terms of all of the other states in North America in 1860. The 1860 census put the entire United States population at around 30, just shy of 32 million. Now, in terms of population for the two belligerents, the United States had a population of 22.5 million people, and the Confederate States had a population of 9.1 million, a huge advantage for the United States coming into the war. It must also be noted that of that 9.1 million people in the Confederate States, about roughly 4 million of that population was African American. A little over 500,000 to 700,000 people from the United States joined the Confederate war effort to bring the total population of European Americans in the Confederate States to just shy of 6 million people. A very sizable population, very sizable populations in Western Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina, and of course the Alabama uplands and the Texas Hill Country were anti-secessionists, and really all the other states, with the exception of South Carolina, had pockets of pro-United States sentiment, typically in the mountainous and hilly regions where heavy cash crop plantation slave-based labor really wasn't feasible. It's also estimated that about 100,000 African Americans, many of whom were former slaves, either runaways or freedmen, left the United States, left the Confederate States, to fight for the United States during the war. Now, the Confederate States, in the Confederate States, slaves did not carry arms for the Confederate States. Toward the end phase of the war, they had decided to adopt the position of arming slaves, and there were slave drilling in Richmond as the city fell to the United States. But during the course of the war, no slaves served on the battlefield in a military capacity for the Confederate States of America. They did, however, perform the necessary duties domestically that allowed a disproportionate amount of European Americans in the Confederate States to serve in the Confederate Army. This allowed the Confederate States to mobilize nearly 80% of their military-age male population, while their economy still functioned because it was powered by slave labor. In contrast, the United States mobilized 50% of its military-age men, which was still a very considerable amount. When all of these factors are taken into consideration, you find that the United States simply held a 2.5 to 1 advantage over the Confederate States in terms of population, of soldiers and so forth, in terms of men actually being fielded for combat. During the war, approximately 2.1 million men served in the United States Army and Navy, and the Confederate number, in contrast, was put somewhere around 850,000 men who went into Confederate service. The Confederate numbers are always off slightly. You never really get the exact number for the Confederate Army and Navy, but it's roughly assumed that 850,000 men went into Confederate military service. Now, economies. In terms of economics, the United States again held the lead. And the United States had, in terms of manufacturing establishments, 110,000 manufacturing establishments that employed 1.5 million people, men and women, mostly men. 1.5 million people employed. In the Confederate States, there were only 18,000 manufacturing establishments, and they employed roughly 110,000 workers. Now, this was an enormous edge to the United States. The United States had far more miles of rail lines than the Confederate States, which and the exact numbers are 22,000 miles of rail lines for the United States and 9,000 for the Confederate States. The United States also had better quality rail lines, and they also had the capacity to replace worn out rails. Now, the United States also had 10 times as many vessels in her merchant marine and 15 times as much, an estimated 15 times as much iron production than the Confederate States. 17 times as many textile mill productions, 22 times as many locomotives, 30 times as many firearms, and an estimated 800 to 900,000 draft animals, which dwarfs the Confederate States' 300 to 350,000 draft animals. In the mid-19th century, and this has to be noted, in the mid-19th century, which is when these guys are, which is when the two armies are meeting, that's how you move supplies. You move supplies via draft animals, and you also move supplies and men via rail lines. That's how you did it. You move your supplies, you move your cannons, and cavalry, of course. Cavalry fought on horseback. Equipment moved by mules on the campaign march. And food production, they were equal. The United States produced more food, but again, the United States had more people to feed. Now, to contrast all of this, the Confederates, what they lacked in industrial capacity, they more than made up for in agricultural capacity. Remember, the free states were openly embracing industrialization. The Confederate states, the former slave states, openly embraced agrarianism wholeheartedly, almost to the exclusion of industrialization. The Confederate States' agrarian capacity far outstripped the United States' agrarian capacity. They had the ability, they had the capability to, one, offset the entire international trade balance of the United States with cotton exports alone. A miscalculation on their part would be to destroy much of the 1860 cotton harvest instead of sending it off to market and trying to get as much goods as they could. They thought that if they destroyed that, it would create a huge demand for it. But nations had been observing what was happening in the United States and found other avenues for cotton. Notably, the British had stockpiled vast quantities of cotton for their mills, and the British had also been looking at developing cotton resources in Egypt and in India to feed their mills while the war continued. Now, in terms of the military strength, the United States had an advantage. It appears that the United States will have the advantage since they are starting the war with a standing army and a standing navy. The Confederate States would have to build their forces from scratch. Now, this advantage isn't really a large one for the United States. The United States Army was a minuscule army. It was only 16,000, sorry about that, 16,000 men. And really that 16,000 dropped to about 13,000, 14,000 as defectors left the United States Army and joined the Confederate Army. And more importantly, this United States Army was spread out across the Republic, mainly in the Western Federal Territories, on patrols there. The United States also made the decision very early on in the war to keep the regular army in the West and did not parcel out soldiers to act as has a nucleus, a regimental nucleus. They did not bring those soldiers back to serve as the sort of focal point, the regimental nucleus for the flood, the horde of incoming volunteers. And this ultimately denied all of those soldiers, or those incomers, it denied them the military knowledge and leadership that the regular soldiers had. The career officers and so forth, the career enlisted men, those sergeant majors and so forth, they were not able to share their knowledge of military tactics, movements, traditions, and behaviors with those newcomers who had to learn on the job. Also, the United States Navy had 90 vessels, 42 of which were in commission. More than half of the United States Navy vessels were shelved. They were not on the seas. And most importantly, of those 42 ships that were in commission, the majority of them were off patrolling far away from the coastal areas of the United States. The United States Navy was a blue water navy also, with no real knowledge of river sailing or coastal patrolling. Now, the Confederate States held advantages. Most people, when they look at the Civil War, when they evaluate the Civil War, they look at it as the Confederate States were at a complete and total disadvantage, and that was not clear, and that was not true. A clear advantage that the Confederate States had was simply in their aims, in their war aims. It must be noted that a tie was just as good as a win for the Confederate States. If they tied, if they drew it out and the war came to no conclusion, they would win by default. The United States had to invade and conquer the Confederate States in order for the United States to win the war. The Confederate States simply had to maintain a field army and maintain a capital and maintain some, if not all, of their territory. That's all they had to do to win the war. They could do nothing. If the United States did nothing, they won by default. If the United States invaded and could not successfully invade, could not successfully conquer, they won by that way. The impetus was all on the United States to invade and sideline the Confederate States' war-making capacity. And that was a very tough goal, as we shall see in coming lectures. Now, the Confederate States had a prime example of what strategy to employ, and that example was, of course, the United States Revolution, that pitted a much smaller power against a larger, stronger power. They well understood that Great Britain had simply given up the struggle to retain her colonies and simply realized that her interests lay elsewhere. Now, the Confederate States also had the clear advantage in terms of morale, because it's much easier for armies to fight to defend their homes than it is to invade and conquer a foreign place, a foreign territory. Now, geography was another major advantage, and perhaps equally as big as war gains for the Confederate States. The Confederate States was simply a large goal to conquer. It was simply a large expanse of territory. They had extensive coastlines, pocketed with bays, inlets, and river mouths. A very large area to blockade and patrol. The Confederate economy could still function quite well with the United States' limited military blockade, because they had all these avenues, all these ways to simply load up goods and send them off to run the blockade. In addition to that, the Appalachian Mountains were a frustrating and imposing barrier to the United States' ability to move men and equipment east and west, and vice versa from west to east. The Confederate States armies used to shelter themselves and easily cross the Potomac River and threaten the District of Columbia from the rear. The United States armies, in contrast, found that when they attempted to go and do the exact same thing, they found that by taking the Shenandoah Valley, they went further and further away from Richmond and the other major targets in the east of Virginia. So again, the terrain and the geography all favored the Confederacy. rivers. And rivers would play a key role in the Western theater and also the Eastern theater of the Civil War in Northern Virginia and also Central Virginia, but also in Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, of course, Louisiana. The rivers, particularly the Mississippi, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, they will play overwhelming a major role in the conduct of the war in those states. There were major avenues of movement for Confederate states. Because and again, this was because there were not extensive rail lines and there were poor quality roads in the Confederate states. This is where both sides were really equal. And Kentucky, again, made a huge difference. If Kentucky had succeeded and joined the Confederate states would have enjoyed the enormous advantage of having the Ohio River as a barrier to the United States. They could easily just sit back and wait until the United States attempted to cross the river and simply repulse the United States from the southern banks of the Ohio River. So the United States retained access to two major waterways, with Kentucky electing to stay in the Union, and they were the Cumberland and the aforementioned Tennessee, which led directly into the heartland of the Confederate States. The Tennessee River, for example, plunges through Kentucky all the way to Alabama before hooking and making its way back into Tennessee. The Cumberland River likewise flows into the heart of Tennessee, which is in the heart of the Confederate States. Now, the Mississippi River has, as plainly can be seen, illustrated on the map, dissects the Confederate States in two. If you control the Mississippi River, then you effectively cut the Confederacy in half and make the war and containing the war that much more easier, that much more simple. Now the United States, by utilizing these rivers, they were given the opportunity to flex naval muscle, something that had never really been done in United States history. They've been given the opportunity to flex naval muscles on the river and by extension extend their naval power inland. Now, in the Eastern theater, the Confederate States, the rivers really favored the Confederate States. The Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York, the James, all major rivers in Virginia, they were used as barriers to overland United States advances. Specifically, the Potomac and the Rappahannock River, major battles will be fought not far from these rivers, and the Confederate Army, the Army of the Confederate States, would use those rivers geographically to their advantage. The United States also had, and really, the United States really didn't have a counteract to this. Had the battles of First Manassas. The Battle of First Manassas really was the first test of a waterborne avenue. The United States attempted to use the rivers to gain an advantage, but the Confederate Army really just turned that advantage against the United States and pushed those armies, defeating them at Manassas and then just pushing them out of Central Virginia. McClellan did this using the great rivers of Virginia to position his army just southeast of Richmond in 1862, and it largely failed for him. The one area of geography that favored the United States, and that was the rivers. Another great factor for the Confederate States was again to highlight this, with the very poor interior network of roads. Sorry about that. In the Confederate States, and this made logistical support that was increasingly vital for United States Army and military personnel pushing deep into the heart of the Confederacy. This made it increasingly frustrating and difficult. Really, when you look at the United States Army's push inland into the Confederates' heartland, it resembles the very slow moving campaign to Fort Dearborn during the War of 1812. You know, they had to make their own roads. They had to cut down forests. It was just a slow slugfest through the woods. You know, exerting all of your effort just to make travel easier. So again, geography favoring the Confederacy in this aspect. As a matter of fact, I mean, and it really just to highlight what I meant. When we begin to cover the Vicksburg campaign of Ulysses S. Grant, you will see just how difficult it was for him to maintain momentum, to move his troops, and to keep his supply lines in order as he moved down towards Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. And that'll do it for this evaluation. For this first view of the United States and the Confederate States. We'll break here and we'll wrap things up in our next lecture. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I am Ted, and I'll see you guys for the next lecture.